want to turn off your video for any reason, please do. Or you have also permission to simplify your name or do anything you wanted to do. That's fine too. So welcome to do that. So for now, we want to turn to our panelists. I'm going to introduce them one at a time as they come to us. I do want to say that in preparation this week, I sent them just a little bit of an email to describe the nature of this forum, and I wrote some simple questions. So just so you know what kind of the panelists were provided, it was some of the questions were, how is the narrative of the climate emergency changing? What's the older story or stories we've been telling one another for many years now? And what's emerging as the creative news story? And how do we help to craft and tell the best possible story we can? And then specifically to each panelist is just a bit of a direct question. And that was, what is encouraging you? What's hopeful? What is discouraging? What despair do you feel? And then the big question that we're going to be, of course, always facing is, what do we do? How do we respond? Okay. Let me begin with Adam. Adam, buddy, it's good to have you here with us. Wonderful to have you. I'm so glad you could be part of this today. Adam was elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly here in BC for Saanich North and the Islands in 2017, and then again just recently here in October of 2020. He's also served as the interim leader of the BC Green Party twice. He's been a member now of the BC Green Caucus in the legislature, and he serves on several all-party committees. Actually, him and Sonia, the two Greens, are pretty involved in a lot of different committees. So Adam, just the fact you carved out the time to be here today, I know it's really so appreciative. Adam's a member of the Sartlip First Nation. He was raised in the traditional territory, Saanich Peninsula, surrounded by the Salish Sea. He's interested in communications. It led him to, first of all, broadcasting and community and media relations. And then after a decade in business in that area, Adam turned his focus to the community as an elected official. He was twice elected as a councillor for the district of Central Saanich, and then from 2008 to 2012, but he served his community by building relationships. And that's what Adam does. He connects people. He brings them together to find solutions to complex problems. So born in Victoria, BC, Adam has lived, worked, and played his entire life on the Saanich Peninsula, where he and his wife, Emily, are raising their two children, Silas and Ella. So Adam, welcome. I'm glad you could be here with us, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Aichka. Ait Gwechohela CM Nights Jailacha, Sahanap Tinatine, just lay Senet, Satanich, with Othla Bay at the lungs, essentially what Dan just said, but in St. Chothan. My name's Adam Olsen. I'm the member of the Legislative Assembly for Saanich North and the Islands. My co-Salish name is Sahanap. And from a storytelling perspective, my name has resided in the Salish Sea. It's from the American side of our family in northwestern Washington, and I share it with my cousin. Well, I share it with a number of people, but one of my closer relatives, Troy Olsen, is his name. He lives in Tla'ami, and we share this name together. I was born and raised Sartlip, as it's known, anglicized version of the name, and it's on the Saanich Peninsula and the Saanich Inlet, and it's part of the Satanich territory. It's one of four remaining village sites. It's one of many, historically, one of many village sites in the Satanich territory. And I think to honor the frame of this, I want to tell a little story, because I think that it's important to understand the perspective of the Satanich people and how maybe we can learn from ancient stories. Hales is the creator of the Satanich territory and of the world that we know. Hales. And Hales came upon the beach at our relatives' village site on the other side of the Saanich Peninsula, Sayout, it's called, Houses on the Hill. It came up on the beach at a place called Tequin, and Cordova Spit as it's known today, Tequin, and started to collect some black stones, these beautiful black stones that were there, and the people that were on the beach started to gather around the transformer. And Geelts is a transformer. Many stories. In fact, all living species, there will be some kind of story of transformation. And Geelts took those little black stones and he started to throw them out towards the horizon. And the first stone that was created, the first stone he threw created our sacred mountain called Klein, the place of refuge, it's known. And that sacred place for the Satanage people is still stands there today, and it's now also the name of our elementary and high school, which is also now a modern place of refuge for our children who learn St. Chotham, and it's a place of renewal and a place of refuge. He created that beautiful mountain with that black stone, and he continued to fill his basket with those stones, and he continued to throw stones out towards the horizon. And all the mountains in the Satanage territory, on the Saanich Peninsula and in the greater Victoria area, that if you come here and visit here today, you'll see these mountains that were created out of those black stones. And afterwards, he went up onto the mountain, onto a place that was used, you could see over the ocean. And some people followed him up on that mountain. And after he was done creating all of the mountains, he took the most honorable of the Huilnuch, of the people that were with him, and he started to take those people and throw them out into the ocean. And they rooted into the ocean and created all of those beautiful islands that we lived and worked and played amongst since time immemorial. And he created those Gulf Islands that you see out there that are part of my constituency, my riding, known as Saanich North and the Islands. It may as well be known as Satanich because it's basically the geographic region of the geographic borders are essentially my riding. A little bit further south, more Elizabeth May's riding is the federal riding is a little bit larger, and I think is a fairer representation of the territory. And those beautiful islands were created. The Gulf Islands and the San Juan Islands were created by Geelts throwing the Huilnuch out into the ocean. And with every one he threw out, he said, "You look after your relatives. You look after each other." And he turned to the humans that were left there, the Huilnuch that were left there on the mountain with him, and he said, "And you look after your relatives." And as this has been explained to me, this is a fundamental, a backbone teaching, as my cousin Panach called it when I talked to him about this. This is a backbone teaching. And when Geelts created Smythe, the deer, he turned to the grandfather and said, Smythe was a boy. He said, "You look after him and they'll look after you." It's a contract. It's a relationship. And it's important to recognize that when we look out at all of the living things in our territory, creatures that are great or small, and it's not even living, it's these islands, they are our relatives. We have a connection, a familial, a relationship with these species, with all of the species, whether it be the chapay, the great cedar tree that you see, Smythe, the deer, whether it be thucky, the sockeye salmon, whether it be Cothulamachin, the killer whale or the orca whale. We all have a familial relationship with all of those species. And it grounds you in a different worldview than the one that we, in this building, this colonial construction here in the Inner Harbor, in the Lekwungen territory, the territory of my relatives just south of us is where I am today in the legislature. But it's the polar opposite of the perspective that is in and painted on the rotunda in the corner of the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. That this colonial building and the relationship that the people who have come through these halls and come through and been in this office and the other offices before had with the nature and the environment and the ecosystems of this beautiful province, whether it be just Satanich or with all of the territories of our relatives throughout this province. It's a different worldview. The worldview that's encapsulated in this is one of a resource colony. That it is our duty to be extracting as much as we can, as quickly as we can, on behalf of the Crown. And while the Crown has shifted from directly shipping these resources off so that the British can build their navy, the Queen can have, or King can have their navy, the Crown is now representative people like me and the government, the BC NDP, and the opposition, the BC Liberals, and the third party in the BC Greens. And what's really interesting about the role that I play is that I'm the first person who has the honor of representing Satanich that has connections to those stories, that has a name that has lived and breathed in this territory that I come from and that my family comes from, that name has been passed down from generation to generation, and with it comes a great honor that if that name is still living today, still breathing today, then it is an honor to be holding it. And I have a responsibility to honor the name just as every one of my ancestors who carried it before me. This is the story that I carry as Tsahana, as a person who has to honor that name and honor the existence of that name within this territory. But it's a remarkable difference from, the worldview is remarkably different from what we see in this place. And unfortunately, you know, when I think about the stories that we tell ourselves in this building, we tell ourselves that we can be all things to everybody, that we can do everything, and that nothing that we do here requires us to actually show any restraint whatsoever. That we can achieve the best, as is the story that this government tells us, and that the people of BC, that we can deliver the most progressive climate plan, although I would say that probably the Americans have got are working pretty diligently as well, but that we can achieve the most progressive climate plan while also investing billions of dollars into fossil fuel industry. That we can continue to have a extractive relationship with the life-sustaining ecosystems that surround each and every one of your homes and each and every one of your communities, that we can deplete those for the benefit, for the financial benefit of us, and that there's going to be no cost, that there's going to be that we don't have to be responsible for the decisions that are made. And it's a story that we've been telling ourselves in this province for a long time, just as we've been telling ourselves in this province that we can have a relationship with the Indigenous peoples that doesn't have to acknowledge their rights and the title to their lands, that we can ignore them, that we can exclude them from this place, the decisions that are made in here, and that we can get away with it. This narrative the narrative has slowly been changing on the ladder with the relationship with Indigenous people over the decades. Yesterday afternoon, BC lost a champion for Indigenous rights. Mr. Justice Thomas Berger passed away, a champion, a strong advocate for Indigenous rights. And these were not rights that Mr. Berger created on behalf of Indigenous people. These were the rights that Indigenous people carried and had all along. And it's been decades, and indeed more than a century and a half, taken more than a century and a half for this province and this country to acknowledge them. And yet at the same time, as we pass in 2019, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, we have We have cases that the Attorney General in this province is arguing the extinction of Indigenous nations in the Kootenays, that we have arguments against the Nuchatlat on the West Coast, that they abandoned their territory. These are arguments that have been called out as being some of the most regressive arguments that are still being argued today in 2021. So as we talk about the narratives, it's important that they are followed by actions. And I've been a very strong proponent that when we talk about the territories that we're working in, when we're acknowledging the territories that we are doing our work in, that we also acknowledge more than just the passing comments that we're doing this work in this territory, we respect this territory, but that we also identify the work that we're doing to rewrite, not just tell a new narrative, but to actually rewrite the story that is British Columbia. The history of this place has recently been told in this story, in this book, Challenging Racist British Columbia, 150 years and counting. And it's not just Indigenous people that we have owe an apology to. It's peoples that have come from all over the world to this place have been treated very poorly in the history, and it's that history that we have a responsibility to tell. So when I look at the challenge that we have with climate change and the climate emergency that we're facing, one of the aspects of this that troubles me so deeply is that the changes that are happening in the ecosystems and in the environments, the life-sustaining ecosystems and environments around all of us, are happening so much more quickly than our willingness to embrace the actions that are needed in order for us to actually have a different outcome. That a lot of times the actions are covered over, papered over with rhetoric and with words that make everybody feel good, but in the end don't have the kind of impact that we need them to have in order to change the direction. I saw one of my colleagues yesterday talking about the floods that are happening in her communities right now, and the devastation that floods are causing in her communities. And I can't help but think that that's the exact same place in our province that we've been just mowing down the forests. How would we think that there would be any other outcome than just floodwaters destroying infrastructure, people's homes, people's livelihoods, and costing our province extreme amounts of money to be able to do the repairs year after year after year? And as the floods go, the wildfires, and let's just hope and pray that this summer is yet another year that there are less wildfires than in years previous. And so I look to other governments around the world who are putting climate action and the climate emergency at the center of their economic efforts. And I look to the recent budgets and the recent work that Joe Biden's government, President Biden's government is doing in the United States. I look to leaders like New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who stood in President Biden's Climate Action Summit and said that we can't charge the worst polluters a price for greenhouse gas emissions on one hand and give it back to them in the form of subsidies on the other. And that's precisely what's happening in this province. As you and I and your kids and your grandkids and future generations are paying for the extraction of fracked gas, are paying for the liquefaction of that fracked gas, are paying for Site C in order to fuel that industry with the electricity that it needs to be able to do those activities. On one hand, while the government stands and spins a narrative on the other hand that we are indeed a progressive, we have a progressive climate plan. I'm not going to speak down to the investments that are made in electrification of our transportation network. I fully support it. I fully support not having PST on e-bikes. But it is a small contribution to what it should be. And at a time that we're fighting a global pandemic and a climate emergency and a mental health and addictions crisis, there is no better time than right at the moment that we are in right now for a just and equitable transition. Not a greener economy, as we pointed out in the BC Greens response to the budget, but a green transition. One that puts the challenge of climate action at the center of the work that we have to do, not on the fringe, not only PST exemptions on e-bikes and more electric car charging stations throughout the province, although those, again, are welcome. We voted in favor of them today. However, what we need is a bold and courageous government. And so when I look at what's discouraging for me is that we have a government that in this province that talks about the protection of old growth forests and forests in general, and yet on the other hand is expediting the destruction of those forests through agreements, economic benefit agreements with Indigenous nations that don't have options on the table. These agreements are not do this or that or that or that. You can benefit from this if you cut these trees. And there is so much rhetoric wrapped up in this that unfortunately we would love to be able to celebrate the fact that we do have a progressive climate action plan and that the government has put it at the center of it. And so on one hand, we celebrate the good things that are being invested in, and on the other hand, we criticize the lack of commitment and firm direction to say, this is the direction that our province is going. This Indigenous rights, Indigenous title acknowledgement, the right to self-determination, the return of our ancestors from museums around the world, the revitalization of Indigenous languages in partnership with a different relationship with the world, the life-sustaining ecosystems around us. We need to follow up the good story that we tell about ourselves with good actions, with good work. And just to wrap up my comments here before we move on, I just want to say that I just want to go back to being the first Saanich person to sit in the chair that says Saanich or Saanich North and the islands. I just want to say that my experience, as Dan introduced me as the former municipal councillor in the district of Central Saanich, I was the first person to live on the other side of the line on Sartla Preserve to run in municipal politics and get elected. And it was at that table, it was the first time that there was a voice at the table that had the understanding, the perspective of what it was like to be born and raised and live on a reserve. And the conversation changed. We had different outcomes. Over time, we were able to build a different relationship. And so I think that we have seen examples of how the conversation and how the narrative and how the story benefits from having diverse voices at the table, from embracing that diversity, being inclusive, and not being and being okay with being uncomfortable with the fact that the stories and the words that are being said in here, for the first time, Sin Chothan was spoken in this house after I got elected, and being okay with the fact that there's discomfort, because the discomfort that we are going to feel from climate change and the climate emergency if we don't match the pace of our actions to the grandeur of our words, is going to be much, much greater. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to give me a few minutes here this morning, or this afternoon, I guess it is. It's still, it's a day, it's a time in a day, which is oftentimes what happens here in the legislature. I really look forward to hearing from Wendy and from Seth. I look forward to engaging your questions as directly and with as much honesty as I possibly can. Hines, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks for bringing the depth of awareness around relationship, and also the ongoing question about who's at the table and who's part of the conversation. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Wendy now to us, Wendy Evans. Reverend Wendy Evans is an ordained United Church of Canada minister, serves in Montreal, where she's on faculty role with the United Theological College there, and serves as the board chair for the Montreal City Mission, a United Church community ministry. Wendy's been actively involved in faith and justice contexts at local, national, and global levels for many years. She was a delegate at the UN Climate Change Conference in 2019. She's passionate about the hard work of relationship building in response to the climate crisis. And she also mentioned here, when I asked for a bio, that her deep place, her soul place to feel connected is in the forest. So thanks, Wendy, for being with us today. And it's great to have your voice here with us. We're going to spotlight you here. There you go. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And try to bring a little of that forest inside with the plant behind me. On this theme of story, just looking back to my own story of childhood, some of my favorite memories were those magical evenings at summer camp, where we would all gather in a circle around the glowing campfire, with the trees surrounding us and the moonlight shining down on the water before us. And we would close our song time with the words, "All is well, safely rest, God is nigh." But growing up in this Western culture, all did not always feel well around me and within me, somehow sensing that the growing environmental crisis was at its roots a deeply spiritual one. And the dominant narrative for facing the eco-crisis felt fragmented. Often environmental crisis portrayed as one more add-on issue among many. Or if you weren't a polar bear lover, maybe it wasn't your issue anyway. And only certain people's stories and experiences qualified to be significantly engaged in the work. Even the theological approaches at times felt fragmented. For example, the Genesis 1 myth of creation is often lifted up as the focus in response to the eco-crisis, identifying that all creation is indeed good, and that the dominion humans are given by God in the story must be interpreted as caring responsibly to properly care for our world instead of exploiting it. Now, this is good and important, but I am also grateful for those who have identified that we cannot overlook just how deeply the other Genesis creation myth of being kicked out of the garden and women taking the extra blame for it has further entrenched the story of separation that we see manifested in the Western culture of individualism and extraction, and in the resulting climate crisis, which indeed really gets to the heart of all the crises that we are facing and that we need to face in mending our world. So we must break free from that illusion of separation in order to save what we still can. And I am so grateful that there have always been many who have been engaged in that saving work, including so many of you present tonight, with particular gratitude to Indigenous leadership, holding up the truth across the world's wisdom traditions that all indeed is connected, and laying the foundation that has enabled much of that illusion of separation to begin to break wide open these past couple of years. I see it as a holy tipping point in the global story. And being invited on behalf of the United Church to attend the UN Climate Change Conference in 2019 was a holy tipping point in my own story. I was the first of our UCC delegation to head to Madrid, and day one certainly had that wow factor. And it was not just from the free fair trade chocolate and fruit handed out to us at the door, but indeed heading into that high security and that huge convention center, an estimated 30,000 people gathering from all sectors of society across the globe, the most diverse representation, especially from the Canadian delegation, that the world had ever seen. It was vibrant and with a buzz of anticipation after such a big year in the global call for action, and in the midst of the raging fires, floods, and droughts around the world at the very time of this gathering. The opening plenaries with speeches by the Secretary General and different heads of state, especially from the most vulnerable countries on the front lines, as well as youth representation, were passionate and strongly stated before the negotiations got fully underway. Frustrations quickly grew, though, as seeing how just deeply entrenched those old systems are, as several powerful polluting countries stalled much of the negotiating process, not reflecting the urgency at all. As well, fossil fuel companies given ample opportunity to participate through sponsorship and lobbying, while civil society, including strong leadership from Indigenous and youth delegates, had to protest on a regular basis just to maintain their own allotted spaces for discourse. We could also not forget the human rights violations continuing to escalate in Chile, where we were supposed to have been meeting. In the face of all the inequalities reflected in the proceedings at COP25, the grassroots just kept rising up united, though, to say finally enough is enough. And I was grateful to be part of the global faith community's participation in this rising up, where sometimes rising up can also mean sitting down. And each day we would gather in a circle together to reflect, to pray, and to plan actions. And one particular individual that I was so grateful to have met on the first day was Bishop Philip Huggins, the president of the National Council of Churches. He explained in Australia, he explained he had come because he recognized the deep toll on the soul that those working on climate change were facing. And he had chosen not to come in any official role, but to simply offer the gift of presence in that space. And he shared with me the amazing encounters he had by offering himself in that way, including to lead negotiators seeking him out to be able to do some of that deep soul work. One of the most powerful moments for me was the afternoon we as a faith community brought our liturgy into the middle of the main conference hall. It was heart work, as the climate statistics suddenly became real people in the telling of their personal stories, in sharing in public prayer, in the power of singing together from social gospel to Teze chants, and in the collective call to action. Many conference participants rushing past found themselves turning to pause and soak it in, their own hearts connecting. And media was also present to ensure the impact of our liturgy traveled far beyond the conference hallway. This was an image I took on my first night there. I had a chance to visit the Madrid Botanical Gardens, and that image stayed with me through the conference. And in particular, lifting up that it became clear to me at that conference that the heart focus of faith groups in the climate movement is not taken for granted. First, in the sheer number of people power, with 80% of the world population identifying as people of faith, and so well mobilized locally and globally, but certainly also recognizing this is not a time for spiritual arrogance, that all faith traditions and all people of spiritual background and people of goodwill and just common compassion are called to unite and participate together to become as large a collective as possible. And in bringing a moral voice to speak truth through love, with trusted leadership and spiritual practices, helping make that personal heart connection story for people, which science alone can't always do, and to help sustain souls in the face of this overwhelming crisis. In particular, the potential for liturgies to help shape the practice of what it means to engage in this wholehearted story of our lifetime, in taking time to intentionally to connect to a larger sacred story beyond ourselves, with that story including both memory and imagination and the whole range of emotions that are woven in, especially to be held in love as we make space for people to truly grieve the depth of loss already in this crisis, which paradoxically in turn sets us free with joy and courage to save what we still can, and to be able to bring in symbol and song into that deep work of story sharing. And indeed experiencing that on my final night at the conference. We're feeling once again the power of the people rising up, marching with the interfaith group and about 500,000 people in Madrid, holding our banners and singing songs together. And that call to be visible, I brought my blue wig along as a symbol of the character named Joy, for indeed, there is joy when we do this work together. And so thankful for Tony's presence, representing the Indigenous Church as another UCC rep there with me. How much this movement and narrative has become unified in its broadening and diversity of who is welcomed and invited to engage, that everyone has a common calling to this central cause in the story of our lifetimes, of the story of our humanity. And this was a big spiritual high and a sense of that shared belonging. So coming home, I certainly came home with an intensity of heart and realizing this is where I want to make the central focus of my heart connection and invite others into that engagement as well. And wondering just how to do that. And then as I asked those questions of how do we help people realize how interconnected we are and how radical and urgent the time is, suddenly the pandemic arrived, shaping that intensity and those connections in so many unexpected ways. And in one of them, though, powerfully drawing people outside to do some of that contemplative work of realizing in their own inner souls how deeply connected they are, and time spent in daily meditation and preparing liturgies, even when they were on Zoom, realizing that people are hungry to do that deep soul work in this crisis. 2 liturgies in particular that I prepared that people connected with so deeply. One was doing a 4-part series on the 4 sacred elements. And another one was bringing in the cosmic walk, which is the story, the unfolding of the universe with the language and actions of liturgy, of how faith and science join together in wonder. And so grateful to see how faith communities are joining together to respond to the call. First of all, we have this campaign happening right now for the love of creation that was launched to mark the 50th anniversary of Earth Day in 2020. It is a 2-year coalition of 35 Canadian churches and faith-based organizations, including the United Church of Canada, working together to educate, reflect, act, and advocate for climate justice. It includes 3 components. The first one, guides for faithful climate conversations, realizing one of the most important things we can do for the movement is talk about it and engage in those heart connections and how we talk about it, starting with those common values and really seeing one another and that mutual respect. And certainly not a place for shaming and recognizing that it is at the collective level that we're truly going to make a difference. And we'll never get to a purified, perfect individual level before we're called in to that next step of engagement. And so to help, to assure people of that and to lift people up in that and to help imagine a better future and to be able also to sit together in the grief that helps us as rather than a roadblock, as a gateway to moving forward. And secondly, as a theological reflection, inviting people, realizing that theology is an ongoing way of understanding how we live in this world and the moral and spiritual imperative we have to respond to the crisis and how each one is called to do that in their own way. And so to bring a whole collection of ideas together to create a common communal letter, and certainly reflective of the United Church's own practice of living and being open to ongoing changes and developments in theology with our own new creed in the 1990s edition, to live with respect in creation. And finally, the Faith in Action campaign in terms of bringing together those conversations and that heart work to this campaign that will be wrapping up on October 4th to make a personal pledge, but recognizing in that solidarity role, and then with 3 particular calls And so I invite you to identify them here and to look more into that campaign and the ways that your own community can respond at that systemic level. And the second organization I just wanted to highlight for you that I was so grateful to get to know when I was at the UN was Green Faith International. And the concept of it is local circles gathered around the world at the grassroots, connecting across different faith traditions and spiritual backgrounds to do that circles of care and commitment and action together, and then creating that coalition. And one of the exciting things was, for the first time, for some of you may have been involved in it, Green Faith International held a Sacred People, Sacred Earth Day on March 11th, the idea of the 11th hour for climate change. And in this, there was partners all over the world, including Faith in the Common Good from Canada, in helping be a founding partner. And on that day, as you can see these numbers, really exciting. It was the biggest multi-faith global action day for climate that we've ever had. And this is a few of the images from that. People were able to gather creatively, either in small groups and with all kinds of different, raising the attention, raising the alarm, taking actions, and all then bringing those together. And my group's in the top one at Montreal City Mission. We hosted our own local Green Faith Circle on Zoom with faith leaders from different traditions, bringing their greetings and connecting to that global call. And it's such a feeling, spirit building, to know that your local group is connecting to something worldwide. And to finally lift up two resources that have been really spiritually nurturing to me and helping me sustain the courage for engagement. Of course, in addition to Seth's book, these are highlighted as recommendations for your personal libraries, collective libraries, and book circles. With both these books, I've actually just finished up one book circle today, and they've been really powerful reflections with these anthologies of essays and poetry, with each story and each contributor giving profound wisdom and inspiration and guidance for how we can all continue this work. Even you can just, in the titles themselves, see where the resonance is for that, and particularly that word around courage. And a common theme through all of these stories that I carry with me is that call that, and that paradox of, by letting go of the outcome, especially in this urgency, there can be a tendency to be paralyzed and want to give up. But by letting go of the successful outcome, that it actually enables us to have the courage and to see it as a devotional practice, a practice of love each day to continue. And on this theme of story, I wanted to share one final story that particularly inspired me from that collection. And this is the story by a man named Jay, and his story. In April 2016, during Holy Week, as part of a young adult group of New England Quakers, Jay O'Hara led a 10-day pilgrimage along the route of a proposed Kinder Morgan fracked gas pipeline through Massachusetts and South New Hampshire. He shared that every day between 12 and 50 people braved the wintry weather, endured sleeping on hard church wood floors, and suffered sore muscles and copious blisters from walking. It was distinctly a pilgrimage, not a political march. During the week, we focused on our own faithfulness and stayed attentive to our own need for transformation and repentance. We centered on worship and connecting with local communities through which we passed. We didn't try to make the pilgrimage a big deal to glorify ourselves. Instead, we focused on living in the kingdom of God through the community we had built within the pilgrimage itself and within ourselves. In the course of that pilgrimage, we experienced faithfulness, deep joy, love, openness, and power. And then all those other things were added unto us. We were on the front page of every newspaper in the towns with which we passed. Reports from TV stations in Boston came to cover the story of what we were doing. Other walkers appeared. Strangers offered assistance and kindness in the towns we visited. Houses of worship opened their doors and provided meals. Interested folks joined us in conversation, and drivers tooted their horns. Those working to stop the pipeline were energized and encouraged. And after years of work by hundreds of citizens across 3 states, Kinder Morgan eventually withdrew its permit application. By relinquishing our desire to control the outcome or to control other people, we realized we didn't have to force others into some big plan about how this pipeline was going to be stopped. Instead, we found new powers arising within and among us. This pilgrimage took place because we sought not to vent our rage, but rather honor the pain in our hearts. And we shared that pain and truth authentically. And as a result, people opened themselves to listen, to resonate, to empathize, and to join us in action. And Jay goes on to add, when actions arise out of conviction rather than calculation, humility rather than arrogance, we feel and experience a power that comes from beyond ourselves. The power of a lived spirit within us and moving us through the world. This power isn't always pretty and it doesn't always make sense, but I'm convinced this holy vulnerability is what opens the possibility of miracles. And as Bill McKibben says, hope comes from engagement. So may we all invite one another into that deeper engagement.
Be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle around to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle around to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Thank you for bringing the word vulnerability into the conversation today, and your storytelling, and also really appreciate the fact you brought music into the conversation. I'm going to turn over to Seth in a moment here, and I know in Seth's book he talks about the arts and about music and about other ways we're engaging as community together to make transformation possible and to change the narrative. So that was wonderful just to be able to have a moment of music together. Thank you. It's a gift. As I introduce Seth, I want to also highlight that there's some questions coming in. And yeah, resources, all the resources that I'm going to gather those all up and send those out to everyone, including links like to Seth's book or to some of the other things that are referred to here during our session. And I'll get the panelists to help me out with that and afterwards as well. So yeah, if you've got questions, I'd love to start receiving those. You can send those in chat and just type those into the chat window if there's things that are beginning to come up for you and you've got a desire to go deeper with those, and we'll just kind of gather those up for the second half of our time together. Seth Klein, let me introduce you, Seth, to the group here, just in a few words. Seth served for over 2 decades, actually, as the founding BC director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. which is a public policy research institute that's deeply committed to social, economic, and ecological justice. There's so many things in Seth's bio I could highlight here, but I just want to give you a scan. BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, the Metro Vancouver Living Wage for Families campaign, the Columbia Institute Center for Civic Governance, a wonderful work with a leadership program for young people called Next Up. There's several other things I could mention here as well, but I just want to say that really for these last 35 years, Seth's activism that began in high school in the peace movement and in the anti-racism movement in universities really expanded and continued to move into a variety of different ways in which we need to engage the larger questions around social justice in our community. So it's wonderful to have him here. He's lived in BC since 1993, and he lives in East Vancouver with his partner, Christine Boyle, and their two children. Seth's also the author of a book that's been mentioned once before here, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. So Seth, welcome. I'm glad to have your voice here with us today too, and great to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Am I coming through okay, folks?
Yeah, you sound good. All
right. How's everyone holding up? It's I know we're an hour in, and thank you all for your interest. I see over 100 of you, and I'm thrilled that so many of you have made time for this. Your Zoom fatigue notwithstanding. And thank you, Dan, for the invitation. And I'm very happy to be on this panel with Adam and with Wendy. I am, as Dan alluded to, I'm coming to you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in Vancouver. And I was scanning all of the folks who are with us on the call. I see a number of faith leaders who I either know or know of. I see some Kamloops federal NDP candidate, and so thank you all for joining us. Dan had asked, what signs we see emerging of a changing terrain on the climate emergency. And I just wanted to open by just taking a moment for all of us to recall, up until the moment of this first lockdown a year ago, the degree to which the terrain was really shifting and momentum was really building. Just a few months before that first lockdown, we saw these student-led protests globally, but in Canada, about 1 million people on the streets, the largest single day of protest in Canadian history, as near as I can tell. And then a month before the first lockdown, we saw across the country these solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en, which is unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime, I think any of our lifetime. That's where the momentum was at before this lockdown, and I'll come back to the lockdown in a moment. I want to share some stories from the book. This is the book, by the way, A Good War. And just to explain the title for any of you who don't know why it has that title, the book is about mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency, but it is entirely structured around lessons from the Second World War. And that's not something that, well, if you had told people who knew me in high school when I was starting out as a teenage peace and disarmament activist that I'd written a war story, they'd be mightily surprised. But that's where I cut my teeth. And moreover, I am the children of Vietnam War resistors, conceived in New York, born in Montreal, and my father was drafted in between. So that's how I happen to be a Canadian. And yet I've written a war story. And I've done so because I think we need a whole new approach to the one we've been taking on the climate emergency. The opening premise, and I'm going to screen share one chart. I used to be at the CCPA, so there's got to be a chart, right? Are you seeing the blue bars in this chart? All right. I'd like to begin my talks by showing that chart. These are Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 10 years. If I showed you the same chart for British Columbia, because I know many of us on this call are in British Columbia, basically looks the same, which is to say you see little fluctuations, but it's basically a plateaued line. To me, this chart is it's kind of like a visual representation of Einstein's definition of insanity. To keep thinking, thinking that we're going to keep doing the same thing and get a different result. We need a new approach. what we've been doing isn't working. We are we've run out the clock with these distracting debates about incremental changes. Where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we've accomplished precious little. In the parlance we've all come to know in this pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve and to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations unless we take a new approach. All emergencies start with a period of denial. Let me repeat that. All emergencies start with a period of denial. I was struck, Dan, when you opened with those comments from Richard Wagames, and it reminded me of a quote that I use in the book from Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci. He wrote these words in his prison notebooks when he was imprisoned by the Mussolini fascist government. He wrote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born." And into this awkward interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. We're in that awkward interregnum, where our governments are declaring climate emergency, and yet they're still doubling down on the expansion of fossil fuels federally and provincially. That is the moment of disconnect in which we find ourselves. In World War II, the vehicle I use in my book, historians refer to the first 9 months of World War II as the phony war, because we declared war, but not really. I think we're in the phony war period of the climate emergency, where we make declarations, but we're not there yet. The popular zeitgeist and our leadership haven't really shifted gears yet into emergency mode. But as I say, I don't think we need to, here's where I would offer some solace. All emergencies begin with a period of denial, right? So in World War II, I think many of us assume, Canada declares war and everyone's ready to go and rally to the flag. That's not true. We were a country very divided. I know many of you on this call are from the United Church. The leadership of the United Church was very divided on the question of entry into the war. It took time for people to come round to the emergency before us. Similarly, a little over a year ago, we can all remember hearing the first news items about this new virus, but we were all in denial about how it was going to upend our lives, right? We were all there, remember? And we can all think about, well, what did it take? What was the combination of events and leadership that shifted all of our mindsets, right? I remember the cancellation of the NBA season. Now, I don't even watch basketball, but I remember when that happened, I remember thinking, whoa, this is different. But I also know leadership matters. I know that it mattered seeing my prime minister in front of his house every morning. That communicated that something big was afoot. Something was going to have to change. And now we are in a similar kind of period, a phony war period when it comes to the climate emergency, but it too will end, because those periods of denial always end. The only question is whether or not it will end in time. So that's what we're wrestling with now. There's so much I want to share with you, and I want to get to a few stories. Ever since I released my book in September, I've done a ton of events. I've done 3 to 5 talks or webinars a week since September. And invariably, I get asked the question, but how do you know when a government is actually in emergency mode? And in answering that question, I've been forced to distill this 400-page book into what I call my 4 markers of emergency mode. And here's what they are, okay? And I'll share in the chat and with Dan afterwards some links to these 4 markers of emergency mode. But here's what they are. 1, it spends what it takes to win. 2, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. 3, it moves from voluntary to mandatory measures as needed. And 4, it tells the truth. It tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and what it means and what we have to do. Now, when you think about those 4 markers, we did all of those things in the war. I actually think our government is, we can quibble about the timing and the degree, but I actually think Our governments have done all four with respect to the pandemic. But when it comes to the climate emergency, it's not that our federal government or every single provincial government, it's not that they miss some of the four markers. They don't hit a single of those markers. And while, you know, I have Adam here, I would say this, my reflection on of the Green Party platform, say in the last provincial election, one of the things I appreciate about the Green Party platform is they are telling the truth, particularly around what this all means in terms of the future of fossil fuels. But on the other three markers, they up the ante from the current government, and yet they're not in emergency mode. So we're all waiting for our major institutions to truly get to emergency mode and hit those three markers. Why do these matter? When I show you that chart about our flatlined GHG emissions, why is it that the best we've done is flatline? I think a big piece of that is because if you survey all the federal and provincial actions to date on climate, you know what they almost all have in common? They're voluntary. We are trying to incentivize our way to victory. You know, we encourage change, we cajole change, we send price signals, we offer rebates, we give, you know, tax cuts and incentives. But you know what we don't do? We don't require. We don't actually mandate change. Until we start spending money, and the whole approach to how are we going to produce what needs to get produced? Well, the federal government, you know what they did the Monday before last? They offered a 50% tax cut to the companies that are willing to do that. Same with the pandemic, by the way. You know, instead of creating a new crown corporation to mass produce vaccines, we just try to incentivize others. That's not a path to victory. A path to victory is you just say, we're going to get the job done. We're going to spend what it takes to win. That's what we see Biden doing. And we create new economic institutions to get the job done. In the Second World War, I tell the story of this incredible speed and scope where we just completely retooled the entire Canadian economy. I just want to give you a flavor of how massive this was, okay? Out of a population of 11 million people, over 1 million people enlisted. Now that's a level of engagement. And over 1 million people were directly involved in the production of military equipment. All those people had to be recruited and trained up. And then 6 years later, they all had to be reintegrated into a peacetime economy. And we created audacious systems and programs with which to do that at both ends. And C.D. Howe, who was the federal minister who oversaw all of this amazing production, you know, he was no lefty, by the way. He was, you know, on the right wing of the Mackenzie King government, but he was seized with the task in a way we have not seen federally or provincially. And any time the private sector couldn't quickly do what he needed to done, you know what he did? He created another crown corporation to get the job done, another public enterprise. He created 28 of them during the war. The Trudeau government, in response to in its time in office, has created 2 crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and you know what the other one is? It's the one that's going to expand the pipeline right through your city and from Alberta and my province. It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. The John Horton government, in response to the climate emergency, has created 0 new crown corporations to get the job done. So we need to do that, and we need mandatory, clear dates by which certain things are required. We would say you won't be able to buy a new fossil fuel vehicle by 2025. We would say no new buildings will be able to use fossil fuels for space and water heating as of next year. That's what I mean by clear mandatory dates. I want to switch back into story mode a bit here. So when I set out to write this book at the beginning of 2019, I'd spent 22 years at the CCPA writing policy reports. And so, you know, when I was going to write a book for the first time, I got together and went for walks with a number of writer friends who had written books. And they all said the same thing. They said, well, if you're going to write a book, you got to have a story. You got to have narrative. And I took that challenge to heart. Now, in the original book outline, it wasn't all about World War II. The original book outline was about what do we do about this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. But there was only going to be a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War as this example of rapid transformation of the economy. But as I started to delve into that research, 2 things started to happen. One is I was like, man, there's a lot of story in here. The second thing is I realized there were so many parallels, and not just economic. And in those stories started to jolt my own thinking. They made me think with new eyes, look with new eyes at what it means to be in emergency mode. Even though I've followed this climate stuff for a decade, or more than a decade, it made me look at it with new eyes through an emergency lens. But here's what I didn't appreciate until I've been out touring, virtually touring with the book the last 8 months. It is remarkable to me how resonant this 80-year-old story remains with so many Canadians who have either a personal familial connection or an institutional connection. And here's where it gets fun, is I've been able to make a little mischief with different audiences, because there's people, and whether or not you are a New Democrat or a liberal or a conservative or a business person or a labor person or an architect or a journalist, there's people in that story who are important to you, who are important to your sense of purpose and legacy. And so I get to engage them and say, those people who are important to your sense of purpose, here's what they did in that moment of calling in the face of an existential threat. And here we are again. And who do you want to be? And that's been fun. And really the book is this excavation of that story to offer a reminder of the speed and scale that we are capable of when we actually treat an emergency like an emergency. One of the stories we need to rewrite has to do with the legacy of neoliberalism. When you look at that chart, why have we made so little progress? Why are we not spending like we should? Why are we not creating new crown corporations to get the job done? Why are we not just using the regulatory power of the state to just say, do it? And it's because 40 years of neoliberalism have convinced political leaders across the spectrum that these things aren't allowed or practical. This is one of the liberating things about the pandemic, is it's blown all that up. But the most insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism isn't any of those things. It's the sapping of our imagination and of our ambition and of our belief in our capacity to do great things together. That's what I'm trying to excavate with this story. Now, let me share a few stories. There is a theme through the book. There's a bit of a Where's Waldo game in the book, which is spot the rule breaker. You know, Adam noted off the top there the passing of Tom Berger yesterday. But Adam, you called him Justice Berger. But here's one of the amazing things about Tom's story. He became a justice at age 38. And then when Trudeau Sr. was repatriating the Constitution and it didn't include Indigenous rights, Berger, as a sitting judge, starts speaking out against it. Trudeau was livid and wanted his head. And Berger says, nuts to it. And he forfeits his seat on the bench and he goes back to practicing law until like last year at age 88 or 87, he continues practicing law and advancing Indigenous law. He was a rule breaker. The very first rule breaker I tell the story of in the book has a connection with our environment minister, George Heyman. So if you're a Jew in Vancouver like me, most of us our people come from back east, from Montreal or Toronto, New York or Winnipeg. But there's a little pocket of Jews in Vancouver who came the other direction, including the parents of George Heyman. Now, how did that happen? Well, during World War II, at the outset, when Poland had been invaded and Jews were fleeing, particularly to Lithuania, there was a consul general in Lithuania named Shiuni Sugihara. Now, most people have heard of the story of Schindler from Schindler's List. Sugihara was more significant. Thousands of Jews end up showing up on the lawns of consulates and embassies in Lithuania. Sugihara telegrams at the head office of Imperial Japanese Foreign Affairs in Tokyo saying, what do I do? And now remember, Tokyo is already allied with the Nazis, although we weren't yet at war with Japan. And Sugihara is told, you're to do nothing. And he decides, pardon me, Dan, damn it, I'm just going to do it anyway. And he starts handwriting transit visas, as many in a night as would normally happen in a month. He ends up giving transit visas to 6,000 Jews who then get transit overland, over Siberia, to Japan, and over the Pacific, including George Hayman's parents. That's how they land here. So that's the first of my little Where's Waldo things. And this is the thing about emergency times. I think history and posterity remembers the rule breakers, the people like that. And they will again when they look back at this time. I know a lot of you are around Kamloops, and I want to pay tribute to a lot of those are Indigenous land defenders today, including the tiny house warriors in your neck of the woods, who are doing that today. And I want to, Dan, do I have time for one more story?
Yeah, you bet.
Okay. I couldn't decide which story to tell. There's the story of Louis Levi Oakes, one of the Mohawk Code Talkers, but I'm going to leave that one maybe. And instead, I want to come back where I started to the youth-led moment that we're in. So as you noted, my wife's also an ordained minister, but now a city councilor in Vancouver. So I'm a little biased in this story. Christine Boyle, who was the first, who moved the climate emergency motion in Vancouver 2.5 years ago, first in English Canada. And Vancouver, out of this, has an actual climate emergency plan, one of the most ambitious in North America, and it passes the 4 markers, by the way. Now, if any of you follow Vancouver politics, so it's concrete. In Vancouver, no new buildings can use gas for space and water heating, not as of 2032 like in BC, as of next year. That's emergency. But I don't want to talk about the policy piece of it. I want to talk about the politics. Vancouver City Council is all over the map politically. For the first time in all the years that I've lived in Vancouver since the early 90s, no political party has a majority. They're all over the map. You never know how this gang's going to vote. Now, when Chris brought her climate emergency motion forward, she was pretty sure she had the votes to win, but she didn't know by how much. But all these climate emergency motions ended up passing unanimously across the spectrum. How did that happen? Well, first of all, my wife is very good at her job, but she would say that the reason that happened is because each time one of these votes happened, dozens of high school students who couldn't vote themselves skipped school, rallied outside, spoke in front of council, filled the galleries, and watched. And they basically made it politically impossible for anyone to vote no, including the more conservative councillors. They did that. And as a consequence, climate isn't a political wedge issue in the city of Vancouver the way it is in so many other jurisdictions. Which is to say, this is a political moment. You know, there's all the things we need to do personally and at a household level to respond to the emergency, but the main thing we need to do is engage politically. The lesson out of World War II is that emergency mobilizations at the speed and scale required have to be state-led. Otherwise, if we're counting on enough people to voluntarily do what we need to do and enough businesses to voluntarily do what needs to be done, we're fried. So this is a political moment to mobilize in the face of the climate emergency. And I'll offer a final thought, coming back to COVID off the top. There's a lot of people who say, you know, we're all wrestling with COVID fatigue. And people, you know, they talk about how fatigued people have become this year, and they listen to my thesis about what it means to be in emergency mode, and they say, look how tired we've been in just a year, and now you're asking people to go into emergency mode for a few years. But here's the distinction. The things that we have been called upon to do in this pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. Isolate, stay home. That's hard. The good news is that the things that we are called upon to do in response to the climate emergency are precisely the opposite. We're called upon to go out there and do something great together. And we can do that for a few years. I'll stop there, Dan.
All right, thanks, Seth.
Oh, and I should say out of the book, and I'll share this in the chat, but I've just launched a new thing, the Climate Emergency Unit with the David Suzuki Institute.
Mhm.
And I'm going to share a link to that in the chat where people can sign up to our newsletter and stay informed about what we're up to.
Great, thanks, Seth. I think we're just going to keep rolling here and move into opportunity to kind of glean from the questions that have come into chat, as well as some that I got ahead of time from folks who are coming today and wanted to come in with a couple of questions. What I'll do is I'll direct these at to maybe to one of the people on the panel, but then anyone can pick it up and go with it. So I'll check in with everybody too, just to see if you've got a comment to with our three panelists, and we'll go from there. The one question is, in the title of this forum and in the conversations that we're having right now, we are talking more in terms of emergency than we are talking about things like climate change. Just the language is starting to shift. When we talk about emergency, I guess one of the questions that I got by email was, when we have placed so much emphasis in a democratic experiment that Canada has tried to live up to very inconsistently, obviously, but how do we, build consensus, make sure that we've got diverse voices at the table, but at the same time, be robust in our response? And how do we balance both the fact that, if you look at who gets elected, for instance, you look at the way that we vote, and then the type of responses, Seth, what you just outlined. So it seems like there's a need for us to have a really deep conversation about the democratic context that this can take place in. So I just want to toss it to the panel. Adam, I want to start with you and just ask that question to you to see if you had a response to that question around emergency and democracy, and what you think, Adam, of that question.
Well, I guess just the first thing that comes to mind is that we, I want to just kind of go back to the neoliberalism that Seth was talking about in his presentation, because it appears, in my experience anyways, that the narratives around jobs in the economy somehow creep back in, no matter how it is that you campaign in an election. And I also want to, I think I should, at the beginning of this, fully accept Seth's criticism that even a Green Party platform falls well short, because I think we're all trying to balance being able to get elected with also being able to be here to make the change that's needed. And it's that sacrifice, or it's that, not a sacrifice, but it's that those conditions that I think are really problematic and really, really challenging in terms of how our electoral system is currently working. So I just want to accept the criticism. I think that it's important that we hear and listen to people with an open mind and not take it personally, but recognize where it is that we can improve. And I think that it starts with the type of political organizations that we have and the way that the politics works internally in those political organizations. I think that the democratic conversation, or how our democracy works on short-term 4-year cycles really is very similar to the corporate model. That while we're not while we're not looking at our markers every quarter, we are looking at them every 4 years, and that still is far too short term to be able to be making the decisions that are long term, to be able to say that we put the climate emergency front and center in everything that we do. I think it is a political opportunity, because I think that the world has changed and the world is changing. A bit of a messy answer, but I just think that when we look at how our government works in these 4-year cycles, there's a lot of incentives to do the difficult things early on, and then also then start to create a narrative that can get us reelected again. And I think that that's often at least the discussions that go on in the buildings around here. The other thing that I think, I'll go back to my thoughts that I presented with. I think it's really important that we undertake a comprehensive decolonization process. This is this building that we're in, this rock pile here in the Victoria Inner Harbor, neatly organized rock pile in the Inner Harbor, has at its core a culture that I think works against it. And decolonization is not just about the relationship with Indigenous peoples in this province or in this country. It is how we relate with nature and how we relate with natural resources and what they're there for. And I think that that this has to go hand in hand, and it has to be undertaken in order for us to be able to really do as Seth outlined, which is put in place the mechanisms and the pieces that need to be in place for us to be able to really tackle this with strength, and have it be the center and the focus of the work that we do in this house.
Thanks, Adam. Seth, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I have so much to say on this democracy question. So first of all, here's a bit of good news. The public is ahead of our politics on the need for emergency action. I interviewed many politicians for the book, and I didn't want to interview politicians who deny climate. I only wanted to interview politicians who I actually thought genuinely got it, and yet whose parties and governments aren't aligned with what the science says we have to do. And when I pressed people about that, in one form or another, they always offered some variant of the line, oh, well, you got to meet the public where they're at, and the public's not there yet, which I found deeply frustrating, especially because in my study of World War II, what's striking about those leaders is that they didn't meet the public where they were at. They took the public where they needed to go. And yet I still wanted to test the presumption. And so I commissioned a major poll from Abacus Data to test the presumption. And what I found, in short, was a public ahead of our politics, both in terms of getting the emergency and their preparedness to accept truly bold climate actions. So, and by that I mean well beyond what any political party or government is offering. So that's good news. And incidentally, when you link the tackling climate with inequality, as the Green New Deal does, the support for that goes through the roof. It's higher than any political party. So that's good news. You say though, Dan, when you ask how do we achieve consensus, you don't need consensus. We didn't have consensus. We don't have consensus about what to do about the pandemic. We didn't have consensus about the war. You never get consensus, and you don't need it. You just need enough. But you do need a government that respects civil liberties. Now that didn't happen in the war. There were outrageous violations of civil liberties, in particular the internment of Japanese Canadians. But interestingly, all of those violations happened under the War Measures Act. We don't have a War Measures Act anymore in Canada. In the 80s, it was replaced by a new Emergencies Act. And interestingly, that happened as part of the government's settlement with the National Association of Japanese Canadians, who said that what happened to them should never be allowed to happen again. And that the next time we face an emergency, it shouldn't be able to override the charter, and orders and council shouldn't be able to override Parliament. And the Emergencies Act now respects that. Now, it's not that it's perfect. It's not that we don't always have to be vigilant about such things, but we do learn from our mistakes. Even more recently, I tell the story in the book that when you look at the forest fires that we had in 2017 and 2018 in our province, those terrible summers of forest fires, in the first summer, when the government declared an emergency, the provincial government, and ordered people out of their communities, the Chilcotin said, you know, forget it. You can't order us off of our own land. And the situation was not very good. In the interim year, in negotiations between the Chilcotin and the provincial and federal governments, a new protocol was established around how emergencies would be jointly declared and how the Chilcotin themselves would determine how that would be discharged. And so the next summer, when there was again a horrendous forest fire season that threatened those communities, it went much better. You know, we need to learn from these things. We need our leaders today to be as ambitious as our leaders were in the Second World War, and we also need them to be different.
Thanks, Seth. And Wendy, I want to give you an opportunity as well if you have some thoughts you want to offer to this as well.
It's been substantial, but I'll just lift up that what was encouraging to me, because often, you know, especially in our context, the idea of secularism and that faith voices don't have much impact anymore. But in the global context, realizing there's actually still a strong impact in terms of, you know, faith leaders where other people weren't getting access, they would be the ones invited into kind of closed rooms with head leaders and negotiators. And so just even in our Canadian context, recognizing that wide mobilization and, you know, to bring in that moral voice and to, you know, to engage the leadership and call that action, that just to lift that up for those that do identify with the faith tradition, that they're at a political level, there is still a role to play, and that's being called for by society.
Thanks, Wendy. And that actually was one of the questions that I got ahead of time as well, was a question about the role of spiritual communities, the role of faith communities at this moment. And just a wide open question. You've already made a comment about this, Wendy, at this stage. Is there anything more you want to say about that question? There was also a related question from someone about more general terms about spirituality and the climate emergency and the ways in which maybe on a more personal level we can look to that you know, for resources or for a way in which, you know, because one thing I have noticed even today is we talk about neoliberalism, we talk about consumerism, we talk about colonialism. We're really naming spiritual and religious paradigms. It's one way to frame them, and they're very, very powerful, and they're assumed, which means that they take on the role of faith. So how do we broaden the conversation? Because so often in politics, it just seems like it's so devoid of spirit and soul. So I think maybe because this is a forum hosted by a faith community, we can push it a little bit. And so I just want to maybe start with you, Wendy, and then offer to Seth and Adam to make a comment about this too.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot that could be said on that topic. I think something that struck me, and yeah, certainly that realizing at the roots of this crisis has been named, it goes deep. And so both for me, that despair in that of how huge in a way that spiritual force against us is in this crisis, but at the same time, then the calling that this is our chance to go deep on all of it. And all of the rooted stuff that we see in all the crises, this is the chance to do a really collective mending if we are willing to go deep. And so I think what, you know, when people realize this going deep, there's often a turning to look for spiritual leadership, to faith communities, to say, I need guidance to hold me, because I just took the deep plunge and I don't know what to do with all this grief, when I've actually finally acknowledge this loss. Like, what do I do with that? And where do I connect into community and do something that's engaging in a communal level that's meaningful? And so I think just those that are already in place in leadership to be able to offer that to the wider community, and to be doing ritual, translating kind of those concepts of liturgy into the public spaces, because you see that in ceremony, it can just be that slight nuance, even taking those moments of silence, bringing music, bringing the arts into those public forum spaces, that also is a resonating for the general public, but also then for those in as corporate leaders, as political leaders, that call back to the heart connection, that has a really powerful role that we can't underestimate. Those are some initial thoughts. I'll pass it over to the others if they'd like to add to that.
All right, thanks, Wendy. Seth? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I mean, bear in mind I'm a secular Jew, but what we have to do now is an act of faith. I said in my presentation that out of a population of 11 million people, over 1 million Canadians enlisted, which is a remarkable figure, isn't it? But you know what they didn't know? You know what they didn't know? If they would win. We forget that. It's to state the obvious. We know how the story ended, but they didn't. And they did what they had to do anyway. And that's the spirit with which we have to undertake what we have to undertake today. I do spend some time in the book talking about, they're playing around with this idea of war as a sense of purpose. That, it's not just the question of what motivates us in a grand undertaking. First of all, we need leaders who make it look and sound and feel like a grand collective undertaking. We don't have that right now. And invite us to undertake something with a true sense of purpose and common purpose. And that's really been missing, but it was certainly true in the war. And not just a common purpose. And, I try to I dig in a little bit in the book on the question of what did it take to actually mobilize the whole of society and to hit those recruitment numbers that they hit? Because it didn't happen right away. And in the initial recruitment efforts and the early propaganda where people were, told to rally to the flag and go fight these evil forces on the other side of the world, that works to a point, but only to a point. But it didn't work enough. When I told people I was working on this book and the premise of it, people would say, oh, well, back then everyone understood the threat to be clear and present. No, they didn't. It was on the other side of two oceans. What the government realized, particularly starting in like 1942, is that if they were actually going to mobilize the whole of society, and if they were actually going to hit the recruitment numbers that they needed to hit, they had to have a conversation with Canadians about the society that they would come back to. You saw Canada's first major income transfer programs come in the war. You saw an excess profits tax come in the war. The kind of profiteering we've seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. The Marsh report, written by this guy, Leonard Marsh, who after the war would go on and become the head of the School of Social Work at UBC, was written during the war. It laid the groundwork, the architecture for the whole post-war welfare state. And it was then offered to Canadians during the war as a pledge and a promise that the society they would come back to would look different and more just and more fair than the one they were leaving behind. That's when you got the mobilization. That's when they hit the recruitment numbers they needed to hit. And that to me finds an echo in the appeal of the Green New Deal, that it isn't just about electrifying and decarbonizing our society. It's actually about changing the balance of what we do on our own and what we do together and tackling inequality. That's when you start to get the resonance of a true mobilization.
Thanks, Seth. Adam, do you want to weigh in on this question as well? Go ahead, yeah.
I'll just, I'll try not to mute myself because then it creates some organizational issues. I think it's important, I think, to acknowledge that there is a role for every community of every faith in this, and I think that that's been articulated well in how Seth has outlined this. If you go back to the story of creation, there's this beautiful garden that we've been given, and however you decide to look at this story or the beliefs that come from this story, I think it's important to acknowledge that we were given this beautiful garden to look after, and it was a gift to us. And at the center of it was this tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in this story, there is an acknowledgement that while we were given this beautiful garden, all of it, that not quite all of it was given to us, that there were limitations to our use and to our enjoyment of the garden. And going right back to the very beginning, that very first story in Genesis, humans had an issue with limitations. Humans, both of the humans in this story, had a real challenge with being told that they couldn't partake in a part of this beautiful garden that we had, and that it wasn't all entirely there for them, but that they had to respect the limitations of it. The creation of the Husaitnich territory, or not the creation of it, but the Husaitnich people, the name Husaitnich means the emerging people. And it is, you can align that, the story of that name to a great flood. And this is told by our ancestors, a great flood that Geelts came through the territory and warned the people weren't living in a good way. They had disrespected the limitations that Geelts had put on the Husaitnich people. They were living outside the boundaries that were created in a balanced, in this balanced territory. And a great flood came. And the people were told to prepare their canoes because a great flood was coming. And some families did and some families didn't. And the story tracks very, very close to the story of Noah. And I think there's cultures all around the world that have the stories of the flood. And a raven comes with a stick in its beak as the floodwaters start to go away. And the mountain that they tied their canoes to, the families that believed and listened to Geelts, tied their canoes to Llewelyn, that mountain that I told you about at the very beginning. A long cedar rope tied to the top of a arbutus tree. And that arbutus tree, we still don't burn arbutus trees in our fires because of the role that they played in protecting us in that great flood. And the people gathered around that arbutus tree after they coiled up these big cedar ropes at the base of the tree on the top of Llewelyn. And they said, we will be known as the Husaitnich people, the emerging people. The emerging land and the emerging people is what that means. And this place will be known as Llewelyn, the place of refuge. And that's the story of the emergence. And so I often use this story to talk about how not only do we hear in the Christian stories and stories around the world of the limitations of our enjoyment of this garden that we live in, but also the opportunity that comes out of learning from that in emerging as people that have a new understanding of those limitations. Because just as I talked about the floods that are happening in my colleague's territory up in the Caribou, these lessons are very hard for us to learn. We pay a significant consequence. And so I just want to acknowledge that forever in all of our stories, there is the opportunity for us to enjoy the benefits of this beautiful garden that we live in, but that we always have had the limitations put before us. And it will be when we embrace those limitations that we can enjoy this place with those limitations that I think we will then get back to this harmonious balance that we need to find sooner than later.
Thanks, Adam. One other question, and it's been touched on a few times this afternoon, is the question for all of us here, which is a question of activism and the place of activism right now. You know, coming out of the pandemic, what do you see as the role and place of activism? I was debating on what to bring in to kind of start us off tonight, and I almost brought a video of my daughter Allie, who was arrested in front of the Burnaby Tank Farm, and a wonderful video of her meditation and then her arrest and her being taken away. And I thought about bringing it, and I thought, oh no, I'm not going to bring it because it's, you know, it's first of all, I start crying. That's number one problem. The number two problem would be that framing the conversation today solely around sort of activism, but I do want to talk about it, public activism, civil disobedience, because a lot of us in this space, I know, are having that active conversation with each other about how do we get engaged. And it always seems like the most visible form, certainly the one the media actually responds to in the midst of mainstream media, the things they don't respond to, but the things they do. And it does give, and Seth, you made a mention to, or Wendy, sorry, you made a wonderful story about activism that comes out of the gas pipeline on the East Coast in the Quaker community there. So yeah, I'm wide open conversation as we're kind of moving towards our end here, but I just wanted to raise the question around the role of activism now. And Seth, we'll toss it to you first to begin this one.
Well, as I said earlier, this is a moment for political action and engagement. We aren't going to achieve what we now need to achieve through individual actions that we take at the household level to lower our emissions. And indeed, that's one of my critiques of the environmental movement in the book, is that for too long we've individualized the solutions. That's the thing about a war. It's an inherently collective undertaking. And that means it's political. Now, there's different forms that kind of political engagement can take for different people, and everyone has to find their own comfort level. You know, minimally, it's protest, whether or not for some people it's the next step, which is, as you say, peaceful civil disobedience. But that is surely a part of it. I am hard pressed to think of a single social movement that didn't have peaceful civil disobedience as a key piece of its toolbox. And we're already seeing that in the climate mobilization. And when I said right off the bat, the ways in which the terrain has shifted in the year leading up to the pandemic, it was a bunch of young people skipping school. And it was a bunch of land defenders and people acting in solidarity with them. And they're all breaking the rules because that's what this moment demands. The question of divestment is also a key part of it. And as some people on this call will know, my wife was part of the motion to get the United Church to divest a few years ago successfully. And it's great that happened. The nice thing about the divestment movement is for so many of, ordinary folks for whom, the idea of engaging in high level politics or let alone international, climate politics is just so far removed. Divestment targets the institutions in our lives, whether it's our faith institutions or our union pension funds or our municipal investment funds or what have you. There's a campaign there for any of us to grab hold of. And like Blockadia efforts on fossil fuel infrastructure, they're two parts of trying to slow this ship down until such time as our mainstream politics comes into alignment with what the science says we must urgently do.
Thanks, Seth. Wendy, I want to give you an opportunity here. It's a bit of a closing for all of us as well at the same time.
Yeah, I just really appreciate Seth lifting up how so much of the focus too has come out of the individualistic culture and then saying treat this as an individual, and it's just separated us more, I feel, a division. And so for me, it's been really freeing to recognize that that call to advocacy is actually a call to be in community. As you said, then moving forward, that these are all the things we long for. It is the good life, as Greenface says. We're like, this is the good stuff, the world where we connect. And so that is the story we're wanting to bring forward, that advocacy. One of my favorite from one of the books I read, her final line was, my offset plan is advocacy. You know, that like that one flight I didn't take. No, the advocacy work, that is what's going to change the movement. And so I just really appreciate too, also with this movement, because it is the cause, we need everyone to bring their gifts. And what I appreciate about the For the Love of Creation model is everyone finding their way in and having those different levels of engagement, but that it combines to come together collectively for those calls. And even just the model coming out of the All We Can Save project of women leading the movement, of having the Venn diagram where you have 3 connecting circles, and in the one circle you've put in, what are you good at? What's your skill set? In the second circle, which work are you wanting to engage in the climate solutions? Because the solutions are there. It's about now engaging the work. And the third one is, what brings you joy? And as you consolidate that, then you have your entry point, and you know, the idea of everyone has a role to play. And the more we can do it, always looking for the ripple effect at the larger circle, to not get stuck in one circle, but always be looking for that wider engagement. The more that that's happening across the board, the better.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Adam, going to give you the kind of closing time here to share with us.
I better think of something wise to say then.
No pressure, man.
Well, I mean, I think I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to participate in this. And Thursday afternoons after a long week in the legislature is always a tough time. But I'll just leave it at this. I mean, I think that the reality of what has been said around here about working collectively is that sometimes, as was pointed out by Thomas Berger and actually another stalwart NDP leader who passed away recently, Ian Waddell, who make take individual actions from within inside the system to draw attention and to as was previously outlined, rule breakers to draw attention to what needs to be to have attention shone, the light shone on it. So while there is a collective action that's needed a lot of times in order to draw attention to, and I remember when we were debating Bill 10 in this legislature about the Income Tax Amendment Act that flowed a lot of resources towards the LNG industry that really was what was needed in order to have LNG Canada make their final investment decision. We were receiving messages from members, and as has been pointed out, this is a lot less partisan than perhaps you would believe from the narratives that come out of the speeches in the Parliament here and the Parliament in Ottawa, the House of Commons in Ottawa. We were getting a lot of messages from our colleagues that say, you know, we really agree with what you're saying about climate change and the investments that are being made right now in the government in these businesses and in fossil fuels. We just really encourage you three to continue the good fight that you're doing. And we would say, well, join us. Like what we need more than anything right now is the individual action within the collective of the other two parties, and to say, look, like just having us all stand by and watch this debate that took 3 days play out without our ability to really publicly say it. And so the collective action does require individual acts of courage to stand up and to step outside and to take and to create some discomfort, just like what we saw here with the solidarity marches and blockades that happened with the Wet'suwet'en. The tension in this building was, I mean, it was thick here, and never before, to characterize it, never before had the doors of this legislative assembly been blocked by protesters. There was nothing as uncomfortable. You could see pictures of me trying to get into this building to do my job here through as they were calling us out and calling us down to say, stay outside and stand with us. And the speaker and the security went to great lengths in order to stop those blockades from happening. Those were also the students from the University of Victoria that largely came in solidarity with the Indigenous youth that were here. And the Indigenous youth met with us in the Rattenbury room, and then ended up staying. They had to take, they then took the extraordinary action and had to be removed from this place to make a point that what was happening here wasn't good enough. And so it's important that we remain peaceful, but it's also to recognize that some discomfort is going to be required in order to change the status quo. The status quo is easy. I can fall back to what I know very easily. Stepping forward into the unknown is very difficult. And so it's important that we don't undermine the word activism or activist and make it a dirty word. It is not. It's one of the cleanest words around. To be active is exactly what we need. When you ask the question about democracy, it's inactivism that is getting us into the biggest trouble right now, because people are tuning out and not paying attention and not active enough. Let's be active. And my commitment to you as one member of this place is to continue to be active. We're going to agree and disagree, but I'm going to be active, and I'm going to continue to encourage my colleagues to be active and courageous and bold in all of the things that we do here. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be invited this Thursday afternoon, along with Wendy and Seth and Dan and all of the 100 people that are here. I have so much love for all of you. Thank you for being here rather than being somewhere else.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, and thank you, Seth. Thank you, Wendy, again for being here. I just want to mention that this was hosted by Kamloops United Church, and I'm very glad to be able to provide this forum today. Just a couple of things. The resources, the books that were mentioned, I'll get the panelists, I'll follow up with an email with them and collect all that information together and send that to you, as well as a link to this recording as well. So you'll have a ability to, in case you had to step away or miss part of it, or if you want to share it as well, and it'll be posted up on YouTube for others to see as well. In my work, I oftentimes use poetry, and I made a reference to a poem at the beginning from Mark Piercy. I wasn't planning on using it, but actually it's perfect. So I'm going to use it to close us today and hear a poetic voice. We started with Richard Wagamis's voice, one of his meditations on story. This is Mark's poem, and it's a poem about activism, a poem for us as activists. So we'll close with this poem. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity. They can blur you with drugs till you can't walk and can't remember. They can take your child, they can wall up your lover. They can do anything and you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight, you can refuse. You can take what revenge you can, but they will roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane. They can give support and conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With 4, you can play bridge. You can start an organization. With 6, you can rent a whole house. You can eat pie for dinner with no seconds. You can hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall, and we had 100 today. 1,000 have solidarity and your own newsletter. 10,000 power in your own paper. 100,000 your own media. 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again and they said no. And it starts when you say we and know who you mean. And each day you mean one more. Great. So again, thank you for being here, and blessings on your evening plans. And please be in touch. And like I said, there'll be a follow-up email following from this as well. And it's good to be together. Thank you. It's better than being alone, that's for sure. Okay. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye for now.